They never told you what lies beneath holy ground. In 1862, in the thick woods of upstate New York, federal agents unearthed a secret that was never supposed to see light. Beneath the rotting floorboards of a forgotten stone church, they discovered 143 unmarked graves. But these were not peaceful burials. These were tombs of torment. Each skeleton bore the story: limbs once broken and healed, ribs deformed from pressure, skulls etched with ritual carvings. These were not victims of war nor plague. These were offerings, and yet the government sealed the records. No trials, no public outcry, just silence paid for with blood and buried beneath centuries of theological revision. You see, history isn't written by the victors, it's written by the survivors. And some things, some truths, aren't meant to survive. This was the Church of the Pure Spirit, founded in 1825 by the Ravencroft brothers, Ezra, Silas, and Caleb. 3 men with no formal religious ties, no theological training, but what they did have was presence, power, and the knowledge of something older than Scripture, older than Rome, older than Eden. They called it purification through tribulation. To the outside world, their message was spiritual simplicity. To those inside, it was something else entirely. Pain was the gospel, suffering was salvation, and death was the door. This isn't just the story of a cult. This is the anatomy of psychological warfare cloaked in spiritual authority. It's how charismatic men hijack faith to enslave. It's how institutions, churches, governments, even schools, break you down until you believe the cage is the cure. Because once a man believes his suffering is holy, you own him. Ezra preached fire, Silas wrote the doctrine, and Caleb spoke in tongues no man taught him. They built a sanctuary with no windows, shaped in a sigil from dreams no architect designed, 8 outer chambers. One dark heart in the middle, and beneath it, a descent. This isn't just about one church. This is about how belief becomes a weapon, how men surrender their minds, their bodies, even their children, in the name of something they never understood. You were never meant to hear this, but now you have. And once you enter Ravencroft's spiral, there is no turning back. Didn't walk into the church. They were led. By 1826, the Ravencroft brothers had already begun their quiet harvest. But they didn't seek the strong. No, they sought the fractured, the widows, the failed. The men on the edge of ruin, the women holding too many graves inside them, the forgotten, the broken. Because when your world is ashes, even false fire feels warm. And these men, they knew exactly how to light that fire. Ezra, the eldest, didn't just preach, he penetrated. When he looked into your eyes, you felt seen in a way that made you ashamed of who you were. He offered no mercy, only meaning. And meaning is a drug more potent than morphine. Silas, quiet, bookish, always watching, was the architect. He wrote the doctrine by candlelight, lifting passages from Scripture and twisting them just enough to bind your conscience to your captor. The flesh is the vessel of sin, he would say. To kill the sin, we must silence the flesh. And Caleb, he was the wild card. They called him a prophet, but no prophet ever grinned like that during a funeral. He whispered things no one should know. He could tell you the name your mother almost gave you. The first lie you ever told. The thing you buried in the woods when you were 12. And when he touched your forehead, you believed. The church compound was no longer just a building. It became a world unto itself, a place where names were shed and roles assigned. Converts were renamed vessels. Children were called aspirers, and those chosen for ritual, enigmas. The deeper they drew you in, the more reality began to bend. There were no mirrors, no clocks, no calendars. Silence was a sacrament. Pain was a prayer. Sensory deprivation, extreme noise, and finally, the opening. A ritual too disturbing to describe in detail, but one witness said it left them emptied of identity and filled with something else. By morning, all 3 were dead. The congregation didn't flee. They wept with awe. Ezra declared the ascension a success. Caleb whispered something into the corpse's ears, and those who survived swore the dead spoke back, not with words, but with twitching limbs, guttural echoes, broken teeth clicking in unison. They were not buried, they were enshrined. Their bodies preserved beneath the church, displayed on stone slabs in candlelit chambers the public never saw. And the followers, they prayed to them, because in this system pain wasn't punishment. It was passage. Death wasn't failure. It was fulfillment. And the Ravencrofts weren't shepherds. And a raven. They were butchers wearing holy robes. This wasn't religion. It was transformation through annihilation. The real horror isn't that they did this, it's that they convinced others to want it. By 1830, the Church of the Pure Spirit had ceased to function as a house of worship and had instead evolved into a psychological pressure chamber where identity, morality, and even memory were melted down and reforged into something utterly alien. And the terrifying part was, the followers didn't resist it. They embraced it. They welcomed the loss of self like moths drawn toward a flame, believing with every tear and scream that they were inching closer to the divine. The Ravencroft brothers no longer preached. They dictated. They no longer converted. They selected. And within those stone walls, far from the oversight of any civilized authority, they constructed not just rituals, but a full-blown parallel reality, a spiritual ecosystem in which the normal metrics of right and wrong were reversed, and obedience was more sacred than life itself. The catacombs beneath the church had expanded rapidly by that year, not a crude basement, but a labyrinth carved with purpose, with sacred geometry embedded into its blueprints, spiral corridors that disoriented the senses, descending steps that subtly shifted slope, temperature, and sound as you moved further from the surface, designed not for utility but for psychological transformation, for inducing trance states, vulnerability, and eventually collapse. Each chamber served a purpose. The chamber of preparation stripped you of your name and possessions. The chamber of trials baptized you in torment until your thoughts blurred and your identity evaporated. The chamber of ascension broke what was left and offered you to the fire. And in the chamber of saints, God help us, you were displayed, admired, and prayed to like a trophy of perfected suffering. These were not symbols. These were not metaphors. These were not misunderstood cultural rituals. They were executions, meticulously performed and dressed in the language of faith, crafted to not only kill the body, but to exalt the murderers as divine intermediaries, men who had the audacity to redefine death as a gift. The Ravencrofts had discovered something that power structures throughout history have instinctively understood. If you can convince a man that his pain has cosmic meaning, he will not only endure it, he will thank you for it, protect you from those who question it, and evangelize the very system that enslaves him. This is not a ghost story. This is a user manual for control, and what they built in Ravenwood was a prototype. Between 1830 and 1837, the Ravencroft brothers perfected something even more dangerous than religious fanaticism. They perfected the duality of the mask, the weaponized performance of holiness that allowed them to publicly appear as pillars of morality while privately orchestrating horrors so methodical, so ritualized, so dripping in sacred language that even their victims believed it was for their own salvation. They hosted charity events, gave food to the poor, invited visiting ministers to preach from their pulpit, and only the pulpit was never theirs to give, and the men who stood behind it had no idea that beneath their feet were corpses arranged like relics. Women and men who had died with blindfolds soaked in blood and mouths filled with prayers. They were forced to repeat until breath left their lungs. Ezra would walk through the streets of Ravenwood with a Bible under one arm and a child under the other, offering blessings to grieving widows while knowing full well that, by the end of the month, at least one of those women would be kneeling naked before the spiral altar, begging to be made worthy of the 7 trials, her mind already undone by weeks of fasting, sleep deprivation, and whispered reassurances that her pain would be the seed of something eternal, and the town loved them for it. Because good men are often blind men, and no one wants to believe that behind the eyes of a smiling preacher lies the same cold arithmetic as behind the eyes of a butcher calculating which animal dies next. Ezra was no preacher, and Caleb was no prophet, and Silas, with his endless scrolls of twisted scripture, was no theologian. They were architects of collapse, and every handshake was a brick laid in a temple of obedience. They didn't hide in darkness. They weaponized the light. The Ravencrofts didn't fear exposure. They counted on the impossibility of belief. Because the truth wasn't just too horrific. It was too structured, too organized, too calculated for anyone to accept without facing the more terrifying question. What if this is not an isolated sickness, but a formula that could be replicated, modified, modernized, and deployed again under different names, with different robes, on different stages, and perhaps already has. You're not watching history, you're watching a mirror. By 1838, death had become a language spoken fluently within the walls of the Church of the Pure Spirit. a sacred dialect understood not through words but through suffering, breathless silence, ritual scars, and the cold echo of screams swallowed by stone corridors beneath the earth. And those who remained, those who stayed when others fled, who offered their own kin, their own bodies, their own minds, were no longer human in the way we define it. They were something else entirely, willing instruments, vessels without resistance, eyes empty of self but full of fervor, trained to kneel before pain and call it holy. Each month brought a new ascension, each solstice and equinox a special elevation ceremony that demanded more than the last, and by then the trials had evolved beyond the original 7. They had become more elaborate, more precise, more customized to the psychological weaknesses of each chosen alamph. And it wasn't just about inflicting pain, it was about sculpting identity through trauma, breaking each person at exactly the point they were most convinced they couldn't break, and then rebuilding them around the fracture, like gold leaf around shattered porcelain. You see, the Ravencrofts understood something far deeper than most religious leaders of their time. They understood that pain, when administered with ritual and purpose, didn't just destroy, it rewrote, it burned away memory and replaced it with myth. It severed the link between body and self. And in that liminal vacuum they could implant doctrine so deep that no amount of evidence, reason, or outside interference could unearth it. And it worked. New initiates began to aspire to be chosen. They begged for the spiral. They fasted to the point of hallucination just to earn the right to be evaluated. They wore hair shirts, drank lye water, and wrote confessions of imagined sins so detailed and grotesque that even the Ravencrofts were impressed by the sheer creativity of self-abasement. And that's when the shift happened, the moment the cult no longer needed force. Because the desire for elevation had metastasized into addiction, they didn't have to drag victims into the chamber of trials anymore. They walked in willingly, smiling, shaking, sobbing with gratitude. When a man thinks his pain will bring him meaning, he becomes his own executioner. And that is the darkest brilliance of the Ravencroft model. The hand that kills you is your own. If you're still watching this, it means you're not like the others. You're not here for entertainment. You're here for truth, and not the kind they spoon-fed you in school or church, not the sanitized mythology wrapped in patriotic ribbon or Sunday sermons. You want to know how people become gods. How faith becomes control, how suffering becomes a sacrament, and how that same pattern still shapes your life today without you ever consenting to it. So let me show you exactly how the Ravencrofts built their machine, because it wasn't chaos, it was precision, and the same architecture lives in modern institutions today. By the early 1840s, the rituals were no longer experiments. They were codified, structured into stages, optimized like a corporate strategy. First, isolation, physical, emotional, mental. No family contact, no private language, no mirrors, no clocks, no sense of where you end and the group begins. Second, destabilization, sleep deprivation, contradictory teachings, forced confessions. You'd be made to repent for things you didn't even remember doing. And third, reintegration, but only after you'd been hollowed out. They'd fill the void with purpose, belonging, sacred duty. This is textbook cult psychology, yes, but it's also government training manual, elite boarding school tradition, corporate loyalty building, fraternity hazing, special forces selection, all dressed in different clothes but running on the exact same blueprint. Break the individual, sure. Rebuild the obedient tool. You think this was just a 19th century cult? No, brother. This was a prototype of spiritual weaponization. What the Ravencrofts unlocked was a truth most men suspect but fear to face, that every institution is a machine designed to convert your suffering into someone else's power, and unless you learn to read the mechanics behind the ritual, you'll spend your whole life kneeling to masters you don't even see. But here's what separates you now. You're not watching as a spectator anymore. You're studying the anatomy of control. Let me ask you something, not to entertain you, but to confront you. How many of your beliefs were chosen, and how many were assigned to you? Because that's the core of the Ravencroft method. Make a man believe the beliefs were his idea. Don't just imprison his body, imprison his framework for interpreting pain. And they did this with terrifying elegance. By 1843, the Ravencrofts had trained their inner circle, those they called the Fathers of Ash, to replicate their method in smaller cells throughout the region. These weren't random fanatics. They were former school teachers, military officers, even surgeons. Men with structure. Men who understood hierarchy. Men who, once broken, became terrifyingly effective at breaking others. One such father was Josiah Mern, a former physician who was lured into the church after the death of his wife and child. They didn't save him. They erased him. Within 6 months, he was performing the 7 trials himself, and worse, he innovated, introduced new instruments, began marking victims with surgical precision, etching symbols into skin like a map of pain and transformation. This wasn't just death, it was data. Silas Ravencroft meticulously documented every variation, every reaction, every chant that yielded tears, every technique that accelerated the collapse of identity. These records weren't theological, they were psychological. Do you understand what that means? It means the Church of the Pure Spirit wasn't a cult. It was a black site disguised as a chapel, a hidden psychological laboratory refining the art of domination under the guise of salvation. And it worked. Membership surged. Wealthy families from Boston and Albany sent their wayward sons to be disciplined by the Spirit. Disgraced clergymen offered their services in exchange for penance. By 1845, the Ravencrofts had influence in county offices, newspapers, and even the courts. When complaints emerged about missing people, strange lights, or screams in the woods, those files disappeared, witnesses recanted, and the few investigators who visited. They were either converted or never heard from again. What was once a stone church in the forest had become a machine of silence, and the only way to understand it now is to stop thinking like a victim and start seeing the blueprint behind the veil. Because what's coming next will make you question everything you've ever called sacred. By 1843, the Ravencroft machine had outgrown its chapel walls. They didn't need to recruit anymore. The followers came broken. They came bleeding. They came whispering stories they couldn't say out loud anywhere else, begging for the spiral, begging to be seen, touched, purified. And the Ravencrofts had evolved beyond clergy. They were something else now, engineers of obedience, masters of psychological precision. They didn't just lead sermons, they orchestrated transformations. You didn't join their church, you entered their system, and once you were in, it rewrote you. Josiah Mern was the proof. Once a respected physician from Albany, crushed by grief after losing his family to fever. He arrived looking for redemption. Within 6 months, he wasn't praying, he was performing the trials, with surgical focus. Branding flesh with calculated symbols. Designing tools not to kill, but to shatter the self just enough to allow doctrine to slip in like a virus. This was no longer religion, it was ritualized programming. The chamber of saints was expanded, bodies posed like martyrs, eyes sewn open, mouths stuffed with sacred scrolls, lit only by blue flame lanterns soaked in whale oil. Followers were required to enter barefoot, kneel, and chant a litany that included their own name as already dead. And the most terrifying part, they loved it. They cried with gratitude. They begged to become relics. Because when pain is spiritualized, the body becomes an altar, and every scar, a scripture. By this point, local authorities were compromised. The Ravencrofts had judges, bankers, even lawmen in their pocket, either as believers or blackmail victims. One sheriff's daughter was among the ascended, her body displayed behind glass, bones lacquered in beeswax. He never filed the report. Why? Because once you step into a world where death is holy, truth dies with it. By the winter of 1845, the church no longer resembled anything human. It had become a sealed ecosystem, an engineered world cut off from external morality, protected by power and fueled by something far darker than belief. Submission turned into sacrament. The chambers beneath the earth had grown into a full subterranean complex mapped like a ritual circuit board. Each hallway curved precisely, each chamber aligned to celestial points, each spiral carved into the stone a mirror of the initiate's internal descent. This wasn't accidental. Prophet Caleb claimed the blueprints had come in dreams, visions delivered in a language not his own. Silas transcribed them by candlelight, copying symbols that don't match any known script, symbols that still appear in other rituals and secret societies to this day. That's when the second ascension doctrine began. No longer were victims only chosen for elevation. They were bred. Young girls were hand-selected, purified, and kept in isolation to bear children of the Spirit. These children were born in the catacombs, never seeing sunlight, never hearing any language but scripture, never touched by anyone but the Ravencrofts and their mothers of silence. Some died in infancy, some didn't. The ones who survived, they were not like the others. One bit, they were not. Witnesses who later escaped described children who never cried, who sat in meditation for hours without blinking, who knew things, intimate things, about people they had never met. One was said to have quoted an untranslated verse from Silas's Hidden Scrolls at 3 years old. At 3 years old. These children were referred to as the Emberborn. They weren't meant to be followers. They were meant to be heirs. A new generation raised entirely in the doctrine, untouched by outside thought, pure from origin. The Ravencrofts didn't just want obedience. They wanted legacy, continuity. A bloodline that could carry the spiral doctrine past their own deaths. And this is the moment, viewer, where you need to stop asking, how could they, and start asking the real question. How many systems around you are built to last in the same way? With beliefs designed to survive inspection, with structures too big to fail, with children raised not to question, but to replace the founders. The Ravencrofts didn't vanish. They evolved. By 1847, the Ravencroft compound had become more than just a cult fortress. It was now a living system, self-sustaining, self-replicating, and dangerously self-aware. The brothers no longer had to lead every ritual. Their inner circle could conduct ascensions, interrogate unbelievers, and even preside over Emberborn evaluations without direct oversight. What started as a single church had become a network, a distributed organism of belief hidden under the cloak of holiness. And outside, nothing. No newspaper editor dared publish rumors. No judge issued warrants. No preacher publicly questioned them. Because by now, the Ravencrofts had learned the final rule of long-term control. Make yourself useful to power. And they did. They provided a cleansing services for high society. Wealthy families with mentally ill sons or scandal-ridden daughters could discreetly send them to Ravenwood. They were told they'd be spiritually reformed, healed, made whole. Some did return, hollow-eyed, unnaturally quiet, obedient to a fault. Others never did. But no questions were asked, because silence is always for sale. And what few realized was that the church had begun exporting its doctrine, not just through Emberborn, not just through relics, but through trained agents, evangelists. They were called, men and women handpicked by Caleb to infiltrate other religious movements, other communities. Their mission wasn't to convert, it was to influence, subtly, gradually, quietly reorienting belief systems towards the spiral doctrine, pain as initiation, suffering as purification, obedience as transformation. By 1850, former church members were showing up in revival meetings from Pennsylvania to Kentucky, preaching louder, weeping harder, bringing with them an intensity, a gravity, that made others fall to their knees, and the message spread. Because what's more contagious than pain wrapped in righteousness? So I'll ask you, man watching this right now, when you see rituals of humiliation passed off as hazing, when you see psychological breakdown marketed as a team building, when you see people endure endless suffering and then thank their abusers for it, do you really think that pattern came from nowhere? Or are you finally starting to see the spiral never ended? It just changed names. By the winter of 1852, the Ravencroft operation no longer resembled the crude structure of a backwoods cult. It had evolved into something far more insidious, a precision-built, ideological virus cloaked in robes of civility, slowly bleeding its doctrine into the arteries of a society too polite, too trusting, and too spiritually famished to recognize the fangs beneath the sermon. The rituals were still happening, bodies were still being bound, broken, elevated. But the language surrounding them had changed with surgical calculation, traded in the blood-soaked frenzy of fire and brimstone, dogma for the polished, rational tone of moral refinement and psychological hygiene. As if brutality could be repackaged as medicine when delivered with enough Latin and ink. They stopped calling it purification. They began calling it a therapeutic reversal. They stopped calling it torment. They began calling it a will, breaking protocols. They stopped branding themselves as prophets. Instead, they re-emerged as philosophers of the soul, quiet men with patient eyes and manicured speech who moved through social circles in Albany and New Haven and Boston, passing out crisp pamphlets to clergy, reformers, and early social chauffeurs. Theorists, pamphlets that read like elevated theology but reeked, to the trained eye, of ritualistic sadism refined into principle. And leading this transformation was not the charismatic Caleb or the domineering Ezra, but Silas, the scribe, the silent knife. His creation, the doctrine of the spiral mind, a 400-page cipher masquerading as a scholarly treatise, laid out not just the Ravencroft's theology, but their psychological framework, a step-by-step system for destabilizing, emptying, and reconstructing the human identity using patterned trauma. Spiritual inversion and semantic overload as core tools of elevation, except now, he stripped it of all spiritual vocabulary and called it moral engineering. It worked because it sounded intelligent. It worked because it felt like progress. And most of all, it worked because it promised what every ambitious man quietly lusts for, but dares not say out loud: total control over the minds of others. Soon, these documents began circulating behind locked doors, among reform schools, elite boarding institutions, new experimental asylums, places where the broken, the rebellious, and the unfitter were sent not to heal, but to be hollowed and remade in silence. And this is the truth that most will never stomach. The Ravencrofts did not vanish in flame or justice. They were absorbed, their doctrine diluted just enough to pass inspection, their symbols stripped of their names, but not their meaning, their methods renamed, repackaged, and written into the policies of institutions that still stand today, funded, celebrated, and left unquestioned. Because once you make pain look like progress, no one calls it evil. They call it education. By 1857, the Ravencroft brothers had already faded from public view, their names whispered only in private letters, sealed archives, and quiet warnings passed between certain families who knew what they were really dealing with. Not prophets, not cultists, but designers of systems, architects of human reformatting, men who had replaced the pulpit with the institution and realized that true permanence didn't live in temples, but in policy. Because when they rebranded their spiral doctrine into a secular framework of moral development, they didn't stop at theory, they embedded it into prisons, reform schools, and private academies, working not with fire and chanting, but with silence, repetition, and psychological disruption disguised as discipline, the boarding schools first. Patterned after Puritan discipline, but laced with spiral design, these institutions began to implement regimented suffering as part of character formation. Cold showers before dawn, silent meals, public humiliation rituals, sensory deprivation masked as a reflection time. All justified under the sacred name of building resilience, but in truth, these methods weren't about building strength. They were about erasing the individual and replacing him with obedience. The elite ate it up. Fathers sent their sons to these institutions believing it would make them men, not realizing that behind the oak doors and polished halls, the doctrine had evolved into bureaucracy. Same tools, new language, not a purification, but a discipline. Not a ritual pain, but a resilience programming. Not a breaking the spirit, but a building moral character. And the spiral moved into asylums next. Do you know what the word asylum originally meant? A place of sanctuary. But the spiral doctrine twisted that. They made suffering the sanctuary. In certain institutions between 1855 and 1872, records show patients subjected to trial-like sequences, eerily reminiscent of Ravencroft methods. Extended cold water immersions, isolation in dark rooms. Physical exhaustion paired with religious indoctrination, all administered under the veil of experimental treatment. Doctors who referenced Silas's writings used phrases like emotive cleansing and a cognitive inversion therapy, truly believing, that pain reorganized the mind, that through suffering comes clarity. Do you see it yet? The spiral didn't need a church, it needed infrastructure. And once it rooted itself in places men trusted, schools, clinics, pulpits, it no longer had to hide. It simply shifted form, wore cleaner clothes, and whispered from behind the mask of moral progress. So look around, man. When your school demanded you be broken to be shaped, when your employer told you pain built character, when your church told you shame was holy, that wasn't tradition. That was the spiral, and you were never meant to notice. So they knew, perhaps more than any theologian ever dared admit, that once a man cries in a theater, once he sees his own pain reflected on a screen and interpreted for him through carefully orchestrated narrative, he becomes suggestible, not just emotionally, but morally, spiritually. Neurologically, his defenses lowered his subconscious wide open, his hunger for meaning vulnerable to those who control the frame, and so they planted the pattern, over and over and over and over. The spiral's theology repackaged into the redemptive suffering arcs of every hero. The fall from grace, the forced humiliation, the cleansing trial, the public defeat, the death of the self, and finally, the reward of reintegration, obedience, and peace, but only after full internal surrender. What began as ritualized torment beneath the Ravencroft chapel had become the moral substructure of blockbuster storytelling, and no one noticed, because when pain is fictionalized and paired with triumph, when trauma is wrapped in music and catharsis, it becomes something far more dangerous than brutality. It becomes aspirational. And in that moment, when the audience cheers the return of the broken hero, they unknowingly reaffirm the spiral's oldest commandment. You will be made pure through pain, and you will love the one who breaks you for your own good. Now tell me honestly, how many of your favorite stories were designed not to entertain you, but to train you to accept suffering, submission, and sacrifice as the price of moral worth? How many times did you leave the theater not inspired, but indoctrinated? And do you really believe it's coincidence that the very mechanisms once used to destroy identity in secret chambers now echo in the most celebrated films, the most profitable franchises, the most sacred national myths? The spiral never needed a sequel because it found a screen. And now it doesn't need to bind your hands or blindfold your eyes. You sit still, you press play, and you thank it for the illusion. In 1931, buried beneath a tangle of inheritance filings and disputed estate claims, the last direct male descendant of the Ravencroft bloodline resurfaced, not in a chapel, not in a courtroom, but in a sanitarium just outside Providence, Rhode Island, where he had voluntarily committed himself after reporting vivid, recurring dreams of spirals carved into flesh, underground hymns sung backwards, and a hollow priest wearing his own face. His name was Elijah Ward, born Elijah Ravencroft Ward, the great-grandson of Deacon Silas through a bastard line, raised far from the Ravenwood compound and taught to believe his family's shame was just local folklore, a strange historical footnote, nothing more than a whispered ghost story in the backrooms of forgotten New York towns. But when Elijah turned 29, the dreams began identical, unrelenting, violent in detail, and impossible to dismiss. He would wake shaking, drenched in sweat, hands covered in self-inflicted scratches, mumbling the old chants from the purification rites as if they'd been etched into the root of his mind by hands he never saw. He claimed to see faces he'd never met, Prophet Caleb's blank, rolling eyes, the blood-streaked spiral beneath the altar, and worse, he spoke of a memory that was not mine, but wanted to be born through me. He was a scholar by training, a professor of comparative religion at Yale, and he began researching his lineage, tracing records sealed for over a century, unearthing the last known transcripts of Ravencroft sermons, finding references in private university archives that had been deliberately mislabeled or relocated. And what he discovered, what drove him nearly mad, was that the Ravencrofts had not merely created a theology. They had created a blueprint for intergenerational transmission, not of faith but of psychic infection. They believed memory could leap bloodlines. That trauma, if properly encoded through ritual, could bypass time itself. That the spiral was not just a pattern in stone, but a mental virus, passed like a genetic curse, activating only when the conditions of belief, suffering, and descent aligned again in a single host. Elijah was that host, and the spiral had waited patiently. So he fled to Providence, locked himself away, and began a series of private writings known now as the Ward Transmissions, documents never published, but passed hand to hand through a small inner circle of rogue historians, psychotherapists, and what some would call occult defectors. In those writings, Elijah makes one terrifying claim: the Ravencroft doctrine was not a religion. It was a seed, and I am its harvest. Now think, how many of us walk through life with thoughts we didn't plant? How many of our compulsions, shames, dreams aren't ours at all? And when the spiral finds a host again, will he know he's been chosen? Locked in a padded room with nothing but candlelight and pages of shaking, fevered script, Elijah Ward began transcribing what he called ancestral downloads, visions, symbols, phrases that did not belong to his conscious self but emerged in trance, states with such urgency and precision that he was convinced they weren't hallucinations but messages, instructions, carried down through the Ravencroft bloodline like encrypted commands waiting to be unlocked. What emerged over 700 pages, now known collectively as the Ward Transmissions, reads not like theology but like blueprint, a dark anatomy of control, built from the scaffolding of spiral doctrine, but reconstructed for an age that would soon abandon sacred altars for circuitry. Ritual torment for screen addiction and spiritual surrender for psychological compliance. Ward writes, the spiral no longer requires belief. It only requires repetition. If the pattern is observed, the outcome is inevitable, and the next temple will not be built from stone, but from data. From stone, but from data. What he meant was this: the 7 trials of purification, the original tortures, were never ends in themselves. They were symbolic protocols for eroding ego, destabilizing identity, and opening the psyche to imposed programming, the humiliation of trial, the isolation, the false catharsis. All of it, he realized, could be mirrored, not just in religious cults, but in modern information environments. Elijah noticed that spiral logic had already begun appearing in early advertising, in military interrogation manuals, in psychological warfare experiments. The rhythm was the same: confuse, shame, isolate, break, rebuild, repeat. And here was the most haunting observation in the entire collection. When enough humans are conditioned to endure pain silently, to crave affirmation through external algorithms, and to willingly offer their personal data in exchange for momentary comfort, the spiral has succeeded without fire. Without sermons, without blood, the Ravencrofts didn't fail. They didn't vanish. They just scaled. Because what is a cult, if not a prototype for mass behavior modification? What is suffering as a gateway to belonging, if not the heart of modern social media? The same spiral you thought died in a chapel now lives in your pocket, shaping your desires, feeding you suffering disguised as empowerment, keeping you clicking, comparing, hating, and obeying. You've been told it's your feed. But who built the algorithm? And what doctrine still pulses underneath? Because if Elijah was right, the spiral's final form isn't spiritual, it's systemic. Buried deep within the Ward Transmissions, encoded in spiraling diagrams and fragmented chants phonetically spelled out in ancient tongues, was a section marked only by a red wax seal and the symbol of the inverted spiral swallowing itself, a glyph we now know from Ravencroft catacomb engravings to mean a return point, what Elijah called the final chamber, the place where doctrine became destiny, not just for a congregation, not just for a bloodline, but for civilization. Inside that final chamber, Elijah described a terrifying formula, a psycho-emotional sequence now used not by cult leaders in robes, but by executives in boardrooms, government labs, and behavioral science firms to identify, isolate, break, and repurpose men without ever touching their bodies. He called it the selection spiral. Step 1. Exposure to controlled shame. Not all at once, but drip-fed humiliation through systems designed to confuse the masculine instinct, shame it, question it, make it feel like a virus that must be treated before it can be trusted. The same way Prophet Caleb would accuse new initiates of hidden sins to fracture their certainty, modern culture now encourages men to feel guilty for simply existing, draining them of spine before they're even grown. Step 2. Destabilization through contradiction. Conflicting roles, rules, ideologies, crammed into every platform, every feed, every identity test, until the average man no longer knows what is expected of him, only that whatever he's doing, it's wrong. This confusion isn't a glitch. It's the spiral's second trial, the trial of Earth burying you alive beneath competing truths until you collapse from the weight. Step 3. Isolation masked as freedom. You're told you're independent, empowered, free to do what you want. But that freedom keeps you disconnected, distracted, separated from tribe, from initiation, from hierarchy, from meaning. And the spiral spins faster because isolation softens the soul for programming. Step 4. Reconstruction. Here's where they offer you salvation. Not spiritual, but technological. A program, a platform, a pill, a coach, a dopamine loop engineered to feel like progress. But it's just obedience with better branding. And by now, you're so fragmented, so starved for clarity, you welcome the leash as if it were a ladder. This is not a cult anymore. This is infrastructure, the spiral one, not because they kept control, but because they taught men to collapse themselves. Now stop and ask yourself, where are you in the spiral? Have you passed the shame, the isolation? Are you in the chamber of reconstruction right now, mistaking your cage for a calling? Because once you complete the cycle once, it doesn't stop. It just begins again. The spiral was never meant to stay in catacombs. It was never meant to die with the Ravencrofts. No, the spiral's genius, its terrible genius, was that it encoded itself into everything that feels normal, familiar, and even sacred. And by the time you see it clearly, it's already part of how you breathe, how you learn, how you strive, how you punish yourself for not being enough. It rewards your exhaustion, it blesses your guilt, and it profits from your collapse. Elijah Ward, before his final disappearance, wrote one sentence that was found etched into the walls of his cell in blood and charcoal, repeated in perfect spirals until the handwriting broke apart. The pattern is the prison, and once you understand that, once you feel it, the illusion shatters, because every structure you thought was built to guide you, to help you, to elevate you, now reveals its underside, a mirror of the Ravencroft doctrine. Work until you break, sacrifice your joy, offer your body, deny your instincts, suffer silently, and maybe you'll be rewarded. That's not just cult logic. That's corporate, that's educational, that's religious, that's military, that's digital, and it's all spiral. We call it discipline. They call it productivity. The spiral calls it harvest. Because every time a man silences his rage, not out of mastery but out of fear of disapproval, the spiral grows stronger. Every time a man questions his instincts because an institution trained him to distrust his own perception, the spiral smiles. Every time a man trades his truth for likes, for rank, for respect, he lays himself back down on the altar. Willingly. This is not ancient anymore. This is you, right now. So here's the real horror. What if the spiral doesn't end? What if it was never supposed to? What if what you're living is simply spiral phase 4? Not torture, not ritual, but voluntary submission to a system designed to feel like your own choice. And now we arrive at the edge. There is no light switch at the end of this tunnel, no soft redemption arc, no cinematic moment where the hero reclaims his innocence and walks into the sunrise, because innocence was the bait and comfort was the trap. And if you've made it this far, you're not looking for comfort anymore where the hero reclaims. You're looking for the exit, or at least a map to the edges of the spiral, before it pulls you under again. Elijah Ward never escaped the spiral. His final writings became unstable, his symbols more erratic, as if even his own mind had become a battlefield, his thoughts no longer his own, his body no longer obedient. He disappeared in 1941, last seen leaving the sanitarium barefoot during a thunderstorm, muttering a single phrase over and over again, break the rhythm or become the song. You see, that was always the spiral's final trick, not to destroy men, but to make them instruments of their own programming. To turn pain into identity, to turn submission into virtue, to get you to police yourself, shame yourself, punish yourself, doubt yourself, and call it growth. It didn't need chains, it needed rhythm, and yet there is a way out, but it doesn't look like salvation. It looks like death to everything false, because the only thing the spiral cannot digest, the only thing it cannot mimic, is the presence of a man who remembers who he is without needing anyone else to agree. A man who stops asking permission to trust his instincts. A man who refuses to perform his pain for likes. A man who walks out of the system not with rage, but with clarity. Because the spiral feeds on reaction. It feeds on your guilt. It feeds on your silence. It feeds on your scrolling. And the moment you stop playing its game, stop moving to its beat, stop chasing approval from broken institutions, it doesn't know what to do with you. But here's the cost. You will lose your old identity. You'll bury the version of yourself that was shaped by algorithms, doctrines, institutions, childhood trauma, and fear. And what rises in its place won't be safe. It won't be polite, but it will be real, and that's what terrifies them most. Because once enough men awaken, not in outrage, but in ruthless self-honesty, the spiral breaks. So if this story disturbed you, good. That was the point. If it made you feel like something ancient was crawling back up your spine, whispering secrets you weren't supposed to hear, that's because it was. Now it's your turn. Comment the phrase below, not once but twice. Let the spiral know you saw it. Let the algorithm know you're not prey. Let the next man scrolling past this video feel the fire that just ignited in your chest. I remember the pattern. I refuse the rhythm. I remember the pattern. I refuse the rhythm. Say it out loud, type it in, and walk away changed, because now you know the spiral didn't end. It just waited for you. For you.